People who take walks at night, what's the scariest thing you've seen? Grew up in Japan, not too small / not too big city. Worked a job that had me coming home daily at 2-4ish a.m. daily. I preferred to walk the back street that paralleled the main street home because it felt cozier and more peaceful. Nothing of note happened until one day. I turned the corner onto the side street and about halfway down there was a young woman. She wasn't doing anything, just staring at the sky. Staring straight up, neck at a 90-degree angle, mouth slightly agape, long black hair hanging. I hesitated but decided that, since nothing weird has ever happened here before, it'd be fine, so I went to walk by. I get up next to her. It's a narrow road so there is not a lot of room to maneuver and pause to look at her. She hasn't moved or reacted to me, she's just staying away. So, I fight my instincts and ask her if she's okay. She doesn't react. I look up to see if she's looking at something, but there's nothing there. So now I'm thinking there's something medical going on, so I reach out and touch her on the shoulder. She jolts and looks at me like she's just noticed me. I ask if she's okay and she just stammers and says sorry before hustling down the street the same way I was headed. I decided to smoke a cigarette to let some distance get between me and her, but towards the end of the street, she stops and stares at the sky again. Doesn't move for the whole 5 minutes it takes for me to finish my cig. I walk down the main street for the next couple of nights. New Orleans, first week of Mardi Gras, and we pass a bar in which a fight had apparently just occurred. One man comes out of the bar, face bloody, and I've never seen that look in another person's eyes. He was so crazed he was all animal, no human. He started swinging at people on the street, right in front of me and my friend who didn't see him. I'll pull my mate back before he gets hit and this guy goes wild in the street. The police officers were nearby so they grabbed him, walked him to the police car. He wouldn't go in the car door to get inside the patrol car, so one police officer takes the guy by the back of the head, slams his face into the trunk, knocks the guy out, and they stuff him into the patrol car and drive off. Lasted 20 seconds tops. Seemed like a long time. I've never been afraid of the dark. Grew up in the countryside, where the nearest streetlight was 10 miles away, so I'm comfortable in dark places, so much so that I often take my dog for a walk at around midnight just because I like the peace and quiet of the night. I live in a city now, so something about the dark is just soothing to me. That being said, one of the scariest things I've ever experienced, I genuinely have no explanation for. Living in a city, I used to drive out 20 to 30 miles into the country to do some astrophotography. As I'm driving out one night, I see this guy walking at the side of the road with no lights, reflectors, and a big backpack. Didn't think much of it other than it being a little odd. 5 miles later, I see the same guy walking again. I haven't changed directions, turned, and I've been doing 50 mph. As I drove past, he looked and waved at me. I was pretty spooked, but I drove on. I must be imagining things. It can't be the same guy. I get to my field in the middle of nowhere, park up and get the camera out, and turn off all the lights so my eyes adjust to the dark. All is going well, and for 30 minutes I'm content, and starting to relax. Suddenly I heard a rustling near the hedge by the road. Crunching leaves, grass being kicked. It was footsteps. I immediately get a feeling of dread, like I'm in severe danger and something bad is going to happen. I grab my camera, toss it in the car, get in, lock the doors, and turn on the headlights. When I turn out of the field, I passed where I heard the noise and saw fresh footprints in the mud but no sign of anyone. I race back home, driving double the speed limit, constantly checking my mirrors for anyone. I park around the corner and wait in the car with the lights off for 30 minutes, watching. Nothing shows up. I get home, lock all the doors and sleep with a knife under my pillow that night. I honestly don't know what really happened that night, but part of me knows that creepy guy I passed on the road twice was in that field. Our planned camping spot for the night was full. We'd backpacked all day to get to that location and there wasn't anywhere close to set up our tents. We called our guy on the outside to come pick us up as it was getting late. We didn't have anywhere to set up camp, and a storm was approaching. We hiked to the nearest exit point on the trail, met our pickup guy, and he drove us a few miles to the nearest campsite we were familiar with that we could basically drive up to. Long logging path pretty deep in the mountains that we had hiked to in previous years, so we were kinda familiar with the area. Anyways, we hop out of the van, and it's pitch black out. No moon, it's April in the mountains and still pretty chilly. We're cold, hungry, and exhausted. That's when we notice this man staring at us from behind a tree. I know this sounds like a no-sleep story, but it's 100% true and probably the most scared I've ever been. We notice this guy, no headlamp, no equipment, no backpack, just standing there. One of our group's, former Marine, yells at him to come out and explain what his deal is. This guy walks a few feet out from behind the tree and we all shine our lights on him, and this dude's white t-shirt is covered in what looks like blood smears. He's pretty rough looking, long hair, long beard, crazy eyes, and he was wearing a bloody t-shirt and shorts in 35-degree weather at night. We're all pretty freaked out, and this is a pretty experienced group of hikers who've seen something odd. We ask this guy what his deal is, and he says we can't camp here. We tell him that that's exactly what we plan to do, and he says, I don't think that's a good idea for any of you. We kind of turned to discuss as a group, and when we look back he's hidden behind the tree. As a group we basically decided none of us would get any sleep that night if we stayed here, so we packed up the van and left. As we were pulling out, this guy pulled out one of those red filtered flashlights and ran after our van. I'm not kidding, he followed us for at least a quarter mile on foot. He was fast. We passed a park ranger on the road and flagged him down to tell him how weird that man was acting, and he said he'd go investigate. I didn't hear anything about it again for 5 years. For the longest time I thought he was probably some pot farmer who had a nearby plot, or a moonshiner who was just living in the woods and didn't want us near his still. People hunt all the time out there, which would maybe explain the blood a little bit. But I was recently at an event with some of those guys again for the first time in years, and that creepy man from the woods got brought up. One of them who still lives nearby broke out his phone and said, I forgot to tell you guys, I saw him again. Pulls up a news article and there he was. So obviously, the same guy. He'd been arrested for murdering some poor girl on the trail. Timelines didn't match up, so I fully believe we saw this guy shortly after he'd murdered someone else. He hasn't been charged with anything else as far as I'm aware. I'm not backpacking without a gun anymore. This one happened to me a few years ago when I was in my early 30s. I live in a Southern California coastal town near a major university but close enough to wilderness areas where encounters with skunks, possums, and raccoons are a daily/nightly part of life. I had a somewhat timid pit bull. A past housemate locked himself out of the house and had to break in. When he finally got back in, he found my dog hiding under a table crying, who sometimes demanded late-night walks before bed. Her favorite route was near my house around a large local park along a key thoroughfare between a shopping hub for the local community and the university. The park is sporadically lit and home to critters and occasionally transients. It's also, due to one of those weird flukes of weather and geography, always several degrees colder than the surrounding areas and sometimes home to spooky-ass ground fog. So, on this particular fall evening a few years back, my dog and I were walking around the park at about 11 p.m. We approach one of the poorly lit sections of the park exterior, which has high bushes separating the sidewalk from the parking lot and or park itself. The bushes are right on the edge of the sidewalk and about arm's length in width. All of a sudden my dog started freaking out. Like full-on attack mode with deep barking and snarling. This was completely out of nowhere, no rustling noises or anything else you would expect to evoke that kind of reaction, and uncharacteristic for her. Typically, when she spotted a raccoon or skunk, she was more curious about the weird animal in front of her than anything else, or she would start loudly crying and embarrassing herself. But she almost never flipped out. I immediately yank her away from the bush and run down the sidewalk, thinking, oh, we're about to be skunked. After 25 yards or so, I turn around, pull out my pocket flashlight, dog still freaking out in the meantime, and shine it back toward the bush, expecting to see a critter saunter away slowly. Instead, we see a man emerge from what I later found out was a hollowed-out section of the bush on the other side of the sidewalk. He very casually stood up and looked at us. He looked to be in his late 30s/early 40s and was quite clearly not homeless. He was dressed like a suburban dad, jeans and windbreaker, and appeared to be completely sober. I remember noticing that he was wearing dress shoes and fixating on how out of place it seemed. A bit of background info. I am a big man, somewhere in the ballpark of 6 feet 8 inches, 320 pounds, and I spent a number of years moonlighting as a bouncer at a local bar, so I can spot a drunk pretty easily. After the initial shock of what I was seeing wore off, I mustered my best scary bouncer voice and shouted, "What do you think you're doing?" while my dog was still going odd. The guy took off running at a full sprint toward my neighborhood. I called the police. There's a sheriff's substation at the shopping center less than a mile away, and explained what I had just seen. For the rest of our walk, multiple police cars were patrolling the park and the neighborhood with spotlights shining the entire time. From what I understand, they never found the guy. I have no idea what he was doing in the bushes or what would have happened if somebody other than me and my dog had walked by. The bush was uprooted a few years ago, but I still think about it every time I walk on that side of the park. It was around 9 p.m. and I was cleaning my apartment and I looked up what time this takeout restaurant closed. It was like a 5-minute walk and less than a block from where I work, so I take this walk often. I was drinking, but I wasn't drunk. I was just going to pick up some food in about an hour, go home, eat, and get some sleep. That's the last thing I remember, up until I woke up crossing the street to the restaurant. Immediately fell for my pockets for my phone. It's not there, no wallet in my pocket. Keys, where are my keys? They are always in my right jacket pocket because that's how I lock my door. I found them in my offhand pocket. Then I look around. The normally busy bar-covered intersection is a ghost town. Enter panic mode. I turn around and start walking home. The first thing I noticed is the giant McDonald's sign is off. They close at 11, I know this. Start listening to cars and there is nothing. Walk a little more briskly and the pizza place I frequent has its sign off. They close at 3. I pick up my pace just trying to get home as quick as I can. I get half a block from my apartment building and the only person anywhere around me bikes past me. Then turns around and circles me. I freeze and look at him out of the corner of my eye. He pedals off and I sprint to my door. My door lock was always kinda janky to the point where I was the only person who could lock it easily. The mechanism just wasn't secure. I got to my door and found it locked. Edit, get inside. Grab my phone, crazed about what time it is. It's dead. It took what felt like an eternity to finally get it to charge and turn on. It's gaining at 5 in the morning. Something switched off on me around 9 p.m., slept for 7 hours, then I locked a broken lock with my left hand and walked 5 blocks before I snapped back. I'll never forget that moment of slowly realizing where I was and not understanding what was wrong. There was one night when a car stopped up the road, a girl got out, yelled for help, then got back in and they drove off. I have no idea if it was serious or not, considering she got right back in the car. During winter, in a rural no-cell service kind of area. Completely dark, no streetlights nor anyone in sight. Temperatures were around 20 and it was snowing. I was walking my dog with a flashlight. Then I heard someone start screaming bloody murder. Flight or fight kicked in. It truly sounded like someone was being stabbed to death for what seemed like forever. I chose to find out what was going on. What I found instead was beyond anything I expected. He was a 5-year-old boy wandering down the road all alone. All he was wearing were light flannel pants and a thin t-shirt. No shoes or hat. And screaming so loudly it echoed through the hills. I dropped my dog's leash and walked up to him slowly, gently and repeatedly telling him that I'm a mom and that he's going to be okay. I wrapped him in my arms and carried him to a neighbor's home to warm him by the fire and call for help. Edit, the boy's parents were visiting friends. The boy got up at night to look for his parents, who'd left him and his sister home, while they were out drinking. He got lost in the dark and just kept walking and screaming. Originally thinking I'd get in the crosshairs or witness some bloody domestic fight is what put my mind in the scared headspace. Plus, dark, no cell phones, no weapon. One time I turned around to see what was behind me just out of intuition, and I saw someone step behind a tree rather quickly and try to hide from me. I stood there for a second to confirm this, then I speed-walked home. Fully creepy. Walking home from a late-night gym session at 24 Hour Fitness. A white van passed by me, slowing down. slowly took a right turn in front of me. A couple minutes later I reached the turn and saw the van stopped at the exit of a parking lot. It's facing back my way. It's like 4 a.m. and nothing else is going on and I'm creeped out. The van starts coasting forward slowly after I make the turn and I sprint across the street to a gas station and into the small dead-end water/air pump station and press my body against an area of the wall that the van can't quite see me. It literally pulls into the air/water station and stops. I hear the engine running right next to me, but they never get out of the van. I just stand there pressed against the wall until they pull out and drive around the gas station into the lot on the opposite side of the wall. I hear the van lingering for some time before it goes silent. Still, I wait a while longer before I leave and run the rest of the way home. This happened to me. I was maybe 13 to 14 though. A big green van chased me around a nearby gas station on my way home from school. At first I didn't believe it was happening, like it was a coincidence, or they just wanted to get to the pump near me, but it just kept trying to get alongside me. I could see like 4 or 5 guys inside the van through the windshield, like they're all leaning over the seats looking out. All of this was in seconds as I power walked across the street. Somehow I was scared that if I ran they'd straight up chase me down. I pretended to start walking home, then ducked behind a tree and backtracked to hide behind a liquor store on the opposite corner of the gas station. The scariest part of it all was watching the van slowly go in circles around the gas station and up and down the street I pretended to walk home on. Even after I watched the van drive away I hid for another 20 minutes, then actually went home. I didn't report it, I should have, I wish I could have, but my home life was already a jail, and somehow it would undoubtedly be my fault, and honestly the repercussions still scared me more. I almost got kidnapped near a train station. Some dudes drove up to me hello quick and insisted that I was some missing Canadian child and that he'd take me home. Coincidentally, a motorcycle police officer happened to drive by, and immediately pulled over after I waved him down. He approached the guy in the car very aggressively and told him off. The police officer didn't arrest the guy or anything. The guy apparently told the police officer the same I thought he was a missing child story, but he did walk me over to the train station and stayed with me until the train actually arrived. I am male and used to walk home after a night out drinking. I had long hair and was quite skinny when I was in my early 20s, and one time at about 2 a.m. in a dark location and I was walking, and some guy slowed his car right down and drove next to me staring. I told him to go away, and at that point I think he realized I was a man and drove off. I am quite sure if I had been a woman thing wouldn't have ended up well. I'm an overnight security guard. One night I was watching cameras and saw someone underneath a grass tarp where some landscaping was taking place on our property. I was guessing this person had probably tried to stash something before they went into detox, which is next door to our property. I get over the trap and don't see the guy anywhere. So, I start walking over the tarp and lifting it to look for any stashed items. Well, I ended up stepping on the poor homeless guy. Scared me. He was cool though, and we first bumped, and he went on his way. I was surveying irrigation for Caltrans in Los Angeles back in the 90s. I was in the valley, on the 101 near Encino, crashing through the brush when I near-stepped on some man sleeping. He jumped up and took a defensive stance. I'll never forget his eyes. They were a shocking electric blue like a bright blue sky. Anyway, I was wearing a hard hat and orange vest. I told him I was sorry to have bothered him, I was just working, and he instantly plopped back down onto his sleeping spot, not giving any more scares about me. I made it down to the off-ramp and checked off that particular spot from my list. I worked night shift for 7 years. One night a young, thin blonde woman was walking down the street at 2 a.m. with no pants or underwear on and a button-up shirt open. I tried to ask if she needed help and she just stared forward, slowly walking staring forward. I called the police, and they came and stood in front of her, and she slowly walked into the police officer's hand and stopped. I didn't stay and went back to work. I still think about her and what was going on. I tell myself it was sleepwalking on Ambien or something, and that she wasn't just assaulted and in complete shock. I'll never know. But she was very pretty and seemed well-groomed. Was very strange. My dad sleepwalked out of the hotel and came to in his tidy whities, hiding behind the ice machine like a gremlin, scaring other guests. Of course, he didn't have his room key, so he had to go down to the front desk and basically let them know he had sleepwalked and locked himself out. The clerk was apparently quite nervous when he approached, presumably because at least one guest had already let him know about the delirious ice machine man. One time I was walking around my relatively safe neighborhood with two of my friends after midnight. We were probably 16 at the time. This loud red truck speeds by us, which is normal for the road we were on. Then a few minutes later the same red truck drives the opposite way, going much slower. Again, just a couple of minutes later he drives by, but this time stops 100 or so feet away from us and just sits there. Realizing that this is not normal, we booked it through the yard to the next street over. For the next 20 or so minutes we saw this truck creeping up and down the neighborhood while we hid behind some bushes, and when we finally thought he was gone, we booked it to my house. He turned the corner onto my road just as we were about to open my front door. Dead body on the side of the street with a sign around its neck saying, "I'm a cell phone thief, don't be like me." This was maybe 20 years ago, in Manila, Philippines. My grandfather too, he was walking our dog at 5 a.m., the dog went to do his business near a dark, grassy empty lot, and they found a dead body bound up with a sign on him saying he was a thief. This practice is called salvage in the Philippines. Basically, an extrajudicial killing done by police officers or vigilantes on criminals and drug addicts, or suspected criminals. It's basically been going on way before Duterte took office, but it's only with him it was somewhat institutionalized and blatant. Before that, the police didn't brandish it with so much impunity, and didn't dare target teens or grandmothers. Nowadays most of the poor are fair game. If you have money and connections you can still buy your way out of things. I once saw tiny hands reaching out of a sewer grate. Took me a minute before I realized it was a raccoon. I worked night shift on Kadena AB on Okinawa, Japan. I started walking to work because I didn't have a car. I really enjoyed the walks. It was a safe way to wind down after work as the nights were cool and quiet and I could listen to my music without worrying about anyone else around. One night while walking home I heard some rustling in the jungle of trees on the way home. Next thing I knew all of the lights went black and all I heard/felt was a loud whoosh coming right at my head. I screamed like a little girl, ran, and dropped my iPod. It broke. Once I made it past the trees, I realized it was one of the giant bats that lived on Okinawa. It scared the ever-living out of me. I was walking home, fairly drunk, from a late-night party and found a girl that had slit her wrists in the park by my house. She was on the ground by a bench. Assuming she was drunk I stopped to see if she was okay, then I saw the blood. She was unresponsive, but still alive. At first I thought she had been beaten or stabbed, but while I was on the phone with 911 I realized it was her wrists. Her face was messed up too, but I think that was from falling off the bench. EMT and police showed up, asked me a few questions, took my info, and sent me home. I never heard anything, so I assume she lived. Scariest night of my life. Almost 100% sure I witnessed a kidnapping. I was going to get my mail late at night while living in an apartment complex, and on the way back I noticed a woman in her pajamas surrounded by a few men right by a car. There was an argument and looked like they forced her in the car and drove off. I found her slipper nearby on the grass. I of course called the police, and they came, and I let them know what I saw, but I never found out what actually happened. In high school, late at night walking home from a friend's house maybe a mile away. Halfway car comes cruising super slowly down the street. I hear someone screaming in the car. I was sure they were calling for help. I started following the car, and as I got on the phone with the police officers, the car started pumping the gas, so I just ran after them and tried to follow them, but I lost them pretty quickly. Never learned what really happened. Was up on a hill in the countryside at midnight when a man with a rifle came out of nowhere, ran right past me, and wasn't seen again. I went home shortly after that. I once led an early morning tour of an American Civil War battlefield, and as I was describing the Union advance through a tree line on the other side of the field, 3 Union soldiers in full regalia stepped out of said tree line. We all held our breath as we saw these ghosts of the past materialize in the morning fog and march into the field. Halt, then one of the soldiers said. After this you want to go to McDonald's. Kind of ruined the illusion. It was reenactors. There's an old ghost story from Chickamauga battlefield near where I grew up. Apparently, a bunch of Union reenactors stumbled upon a camp of Confederate reenactors, and they hung out and talked for a while. The next morning, however, the Confederate camp had vanished, and the park center claimed that no Confederate reenactors had been signed that night. What I thought was a body in the woods, and after a bit of back and forth on the phone with the police, I returned with a few helpful coppers to find a slightly miffed drunk person who'd had an argument with his missus. Once my mom was visiting another state with a friend. While she was in another state, my stepdad got fired from his job for getting caught stealing medications from people's homes. He and my mom got in a huge fight over the phone. Then, he starts sending her pictures of a shotgun that is in our house, telling her he is going to kill himself with it. My mom called 911 to tell them so that somebody could go check on him or try to stop him or something. And they basically told her the same thing. Oh, you're calling 911 in Florida, you need 911 for North Carolina. My mom tried to explain that she wasn't in North Carolina but that she needed help. They essentially told her that she needed to call somebody else in North Carolina and have that person call 911. Ridiculous. Thankfully, nothing happened with my stepdad, but had it truly been a life or death situation, I believe that there would have been death due to how 911 handled the call. Was out for a late walk in the rain, always enjoyed it because it's peaceful, smells great, quiet, and never see anyone. Walked off this trail back into the road and saw a big pile of garbage under a tarp at the end of the cul-de-sac the trail ends in, got a creepy chill like that could be a dead body or something, and I'd never know, just got a weird feeling that snapped me out of my calm walk, picked up the pace. About 500 yards away, parked car with a guy sitting there, in the dark, in the rain, like 11th Mish car off, just sitting there. Got super creeped out at this point and changed my route back to the main road and hurried home. Turns out it was a dead body someone had dumped under that tarp, was under there for 4 days before someone investigated it. The guy in the car turned out to be just a random man, a guy who lives there and unrelated to the body. Still, took a few months off from my late night walks alone in the woods. A 7-foot-tall male brown kangaroo in the middle of the footpath. Buff as it, just staring me down. You bet I turned and went the other way. He just went about his business. Living in a rural village, I was taking a late night walk with my GF, when suddenly we heard aloud what we thought was a human scream. Turned out it was a sheep. Jumping scared us hard though. A couple of years ago, I was at the start of a typical weekday night stroll. I was living in an apartment complex in Florida at the time, so it was the only opportune time to do so, without being completely drenched. The exact moment I was crossing the sidewalk adjacent to the entrance of said complex, I witnessed a middle-aged man punch his wife/significant other in her face, in full view of me, and another passerby. The passerby called the police officers, and the man was arrested. It wasn't a scary situation to my own well-being, but I did find the situation chilling. For one, how nonchalant the guy was in assaulting his wife/so in public, and two, how both the abuser/so were pleading for the police officers not to be called. It was domestic abuse so normalized, it happened in full public, without any second thought/rationale. I was jogging at night once and it was pretty dark in my neighborhood. I prefer jogging at night because it is much cooler. I'm right in the grove and a tiny woman with a miniature Doberman pinscher on a leash freaked me out. They were both so small I didn't even see them until I was running right past them. Just picture a 6 feet 3 inches stocky big guy being startled by a 5 feet 0 inches woman with an ankle biter dog, lol. Over 25 years ago, I was walking in a park at night. It was pitch black in this park, no lighting, other than the moon and the stars on a beautiful autumn night. I couldn't see very well, but I knew the area, and was walking along the road, which ran parallel to a small river. The moonlight would bounce off the water, and all you would hear is the trickle from the slow-running river and slight breeze in the trees. I loved those walks. That was until one night, in the dead silence and pitch black, I distinctly hear a man's voice out of the woods say very clearly, "Young girls shouldn't go walking alone in the woods at night." I froze. I looked in the direction of the voice and couldn't see anything. I ran home. That was the last evening walk I took in that park. In college I would walk back from the library extremely late. One night I was walking back to my dorm, and something told me to look up. On top of the parking garage there was a person glaring over, looking like they were about to jump. I had no clue what to do, so I called the police. As soon as I looked back up they jumped to safety. I ran up the stairs to find them but couldn't. The police never found them either. Either way, I hope they are okay today. I live out in the country, with more woods and fields around me than houses. There are several dirt paths through the woods that farmers use for their tractors, and all during the day. I like to run on these paths because it's usually quiet and there is no traffic, unlike the road. During the hottest part of the summer, I run at night because it's cooler outside. So, one night, it had rained during the day, so all the tracks on the path were gone. I was out running around midnight. I had an uneasy feeling but didn't see anything. But then I circled around, and on my second pass down a particular way, I saw my footprints, but then I saw another set of prints, bigger than mine, that hadn't been there before. Then I saw they made the turn the same way I had earlier. I cut it short that night, never saw anyone, but still. Wow, I did not expect all this, lol, thanks for the awards. I was walking one night on a pretty dark back road near my house at the time when glowing eyes on a round black body came blushing at me. I shrieked like a child and felt super dumb when it turned out to be a big black lab who got to my feet and rolled over, wagging his tail and wiggling about. He belonged to someone in the neighborhood who was taking him on a walk and ran from them when he saw me. He was a big floozy boy who just wanted love. I seriously felt so embarrassed, but also had a laugh. So did his owner, lol. I'll walk my dog at night and wear an LED headlamp, mostly so I can see any bear eyes glowing back at me. 20 feet down the ravine, about half a mile from home, one night there were approximately 30 rabbits' eyes glowing and blinking back at me. Couldn't see the rabbits due to undergrowth, but the eyes. Not gonna lie, it got under my skin. Was leaving a friend's house, 2 a.m., dead sober, not tired. Jumped on my motorbike and decided to take the short way home, which is normally 10 minutes. I remember seeing the road covered in fog. And then I was home. I walked inside to see my mom looking at me all worried because I had apparently sat on my bike for 20 minutes in the driveway, and she thought I was texting but got a different angle and realized I was just sitting there with my helmet on. After hearing this, I checked the time and it was almost 6 a.m., and all my clothes and my phone were wet as if I'd been sitting in heavy rain. I tried an electric bike my aunt had while we were visiting. I wasn't used to how abruptly it would accelerate, so when it did, I yelled for a second. My cousin was taking a video of me the whole time because I most probably would have done something to make an absolute fool out of myself, like crashing, and it would have been hilarious. So there I was, riding to the end of the street and turning back around when I noticed a lot of men holding large rocks in their hands, barefoot, came by as if they're hunting someone down. We were then told to come inside immediately as someone had just taken a machete and started attacking people at a party just around the corner where we were having a party. Later that night, we replayed the video, and we noticed that when the bike accelerated and I yelled, a man walking in front of me was holding a machete. He started whipping around and glanced at me. We're glad he didn't swing the machete. He was so close he wouldn't have gone missing. He matched the description of the man who hacked random and multiple people that day. Once walking home from the convenience store, a well-known Rottweiler stray dog came sprinting across the street in front of me. When I turned to see what he was running from, I was greeted by an angry skunk running directly into my path. Ran all the way home scared of getting sprayed. I saw a man walking down a street with his full penis out, and he was spinning it around like a helicopter in his hand. Like a set of keys attached to a bungee cord, right at zipper level. When he saw me, he crammed it back into his pants and ran away. I had the WTF expression frozen on my face for the rest of the night. As someone who used to make sure trains had an adequate coating of paint, I spent a good amount of time walking around the rougher sides of town at night. Worst thing I ever saw was in Seattle, was walking down the street under an overpass in an industrial district, and a homeless woman asked if I could buy her a beer since she didn't have an ID, bought her a 40, talked to her about her daughters, watched her smoke meth, all in about 2 minutes. She started reading to me from a lightly singed Bible, about the devil specifically, at which point I was looking for a quick and polite exit. Who doesn't when someone whips out the Bible? At that point 3 men rode by with a gallon jug, and doused her tent in something, maybe gasoline, perhaps turpentine or kerosene, really didn't stick around to find out. Lit her tent on fire. She ran into the burning tent. I'll never forget watching her run out screaming and crying, holding a duffel bag, her white coat completely engulfed in flames. I took off running. Guys on bikes didn't look thrilled to see me, called SPD, but they didn't seem to care much after I told them what part of Soto I saw happen in. Hid amongst the trains for a few hours after that. When I was in middle school, most school nights I had to walk about 1/10 of a mile or so to my grandparents' house to stay the night, as my mom worked nights at the time. So, I usually did this right as it was turning night to maximize my time at home. Curfew was nightfall, so usually it was a run. Well, at this point in my life I had never seen a coyote and always wondered if I were to get attacked, could I survive? The thought was there basically every trip, and I had no desire to find out. Well, I moved in with my dad after 8th grade, and when I was in 10th or 11th grade I was visiting my mom. I had to go grab something from my grandparents' house and took a bicycle of a younger sibling. So, I remembered all those nights before with that thought, but now I was a lot more buff than I had been back then. But I still didn't want to find out. Well, on the way back I glanced out to a pasture beside me that was overgrown. There was a figure running parallel with me, keeping pace easily. I pedaled super fast. I entered my mom's driveway and heard the creature coming across the road. Her yard was sloped downhill, so I let the bicycle coast down and I leapt off and full of adrenaline flexed with my arms in front of me and screamed, "Let's go!" It was my mom's dog. I felt relieved, but also disappointed because of the adrenaline rush, lol, but definitely relieved. Found out later coyotes are tiny anyway, not that I'd want to fight one. I was hanging out with a friend one day and lost track of time. When night fell I got on my bike to ride home, and about halfway home I saw a figure standing under a street lamp. Being a teenager, I went to turn around until I realized I was already too far to turn back, so I turned back around to brave the night and the figure was gone. There was no way he could have run off in that time without me seeing him. Needless to say I hauled home. I was walking around Bangalore, India at night by myself. I was a 20-year-old American girl on study abroad. All of a sudden, I saw a giant rat climb out from a sewer. It was bigger than I knew rats could even be. Bigger than the biggest rat depicted in movies or books. It was about the size of a small dog. I was shaken. Then, out from the same sewer grate, another gigantic rat. And another. And another. About 5 or 6 dirty rats were all climbing out of the same sewer, and I was about to have to face them all on my own. I was terrified and I knew no one would ever believe me, but there was no way to get away from them or change direction. So, I pulled out my phone to try and use the flashlight to scare them off. I directed the light at them and every single one looked right at me. They were dark and dirty and now they were running directly at me. But wait. I was wrong. Puppies. They weren't rats at all, but a whole litter of dirty puppies that had been hiding in the sewer together. Still gross, but also cuter and less scary than expected. I have been on many a night walk. Sometimes to clear my head or get a story idea straightened out, but in my youth I would sometimes have to walk about 2 hours home from work, yay food industry. In my countless hours of walking through dark paths and empty streets I only ever got freaked out once. I was in the last mile or so of a long walk home after a 10-hour shift. I wanted nothing but to drop in bed and fall asleep with no alarm set. My neighborhood had multiple paths through small, wooded areas that you could use as shortcuts. I'm walking through one of those and about 10 feet into the woods I hear someone whisper, "Is that the guy?" I noped it there with no shame and ran the long, well-lit way home. Could it have been my mind playing tricks on me? Who knows, maybe the fatigue of my life at the time got to me. But it was real to me in that moment, and I can't recall another time where I had such a fight or flight reaction. Walking the dog at night, when I got home, 2 shifty dudes were waiting outside my house. They asked if Haley was inside. I said there's no Haley in my home. They pushed for more, giving me a description of this Haley. I said no again, and offered to ask the local police or something since they weren't from the area. They left, but not really. They waited in a car that didn't belong on my street. Haley was my next-door neighbor's daughter. So, I was pretty past that my address was used for some reason, but I wasn't going to tell 2 random people where she lived either. I looked outside the window from upstairs in the dark. They were parked outside. Left after maybe 15 minutes. I was ready to call the police if they hung about longer. I called Haley's dad about it since he was on a taxi shift. He didn't know them. Next day, both Haley and he couldn't go over to ask about it. Haley feigned ignorance, claiming she didn't know them either. The matter didn't go as far as that, but I was mildly on alert for a couple of weeks since then. This happened before COVID lockdown. One day I thought it would be good to try a morning run. Now usually I have to be in the shower at 6:30 and ready to leave home at 7 to catch my morning train. I decided I would leave at 5:30, so I set my analog alarm, yes I'm old, to 5:30 am the next day. Due to daylight savings, I actually set it back to 4:30. So, I'm on my morning jog and I mainly jog through bushland, but at the end of my jog I have to go through this main town area. I briefly remember someone in an alleyway rushing out at me with a knife, screaming something I couldn't make out, then just sprinting as fast as I could. I got away with no injuries, but just a big scare. Anyway, I'm sticking to afternoon jogs now. Back in high school my friend and I were walking to another friend's house around midnight. We lived in this tiny town, and to get to my friend's house we had to walk across a massive field with short grass, about 2 football fields in length. The far end of the field is backlit by a street. As we are just entering the field we see the shadow of a human figure stand up at the far end of the field. We just think it's our friend coming out to meet us until we see the shadow turn and look directly at us. It then just drops and starts sprinting on all fours directly at us. I mean faster than I've ever seen. I'm scared myself, thinking I must be going crazy and I'm seeing things, but my friend grabs my arm and points, telling me to run away. We both sprint out of the field and across the street as far and as fast as we can possibly go. To this day I have no idea what was chasing us or if I really saw it, but my friend remembers the exact same details the exact same way. Don't think I can go into fields at night ever again. I remember years ago walking my dog on a dark December evening and having a similar encounter. My dog is a 14-kilo cockapoo, really friendly and loves getting petted by everyone he meets. We're coming out of a dimly lit lane that runs behind a local school, and this 6 feet 5 inches older guy approaches from off the path and is trying to chat and get closer, starts saying, "Well, that's a nice dog, can I get him?" I'm feeling a bit weirded out because why is some random trying to chat on a freezing chilly night when I'm just wanting home? Man reaches a hand out and I just hear this very loud deep primal growl which rises to a rasping snarl. I look at my pup and just understand something clearly at last, reflecting off his eyes and his teeth, which are fully out. His coat is pure black and matte rather than shiny, so this is all you could see of him. Never seen him like this ever, and he's all of a sudden firing out the scary big dog noises. The guy backs off, so I'm just like, "Don't think he likes you," and he walks off at a brisk pace. Was simply weird seeing my fluffy friend flip like that. Don't know if he picked up my uneasiness or some unsure intention from the guy, but decided to give him some extra dog snacks when we got in. My neighbor was a little old lady that had a huge Rottweiler. Her name was Missy, and the story was she had failed police dog training school because she would hoard all the soft toys and just wanted to snuggle everyone. Missy was the sweetest dog in the entire world. Super gentle, really friendly, and just loved everyone and everything. For example, we dog sat when the neighbor lady had to have surgery and Missy wanted to snuggle our cats so badly. The cats were having none of the giant dog snuggles and they sat together glaring at her until she got so scared she had to hide behind me on the couch. Which was impressive, considering how huge she was. Missy was an older dog, and sometimes she had to go out to pee at night. We'd told my neighbor to call us if that happened, but she didn't want to bother us because it was like 1 a.m., so she took Missy out to the kids' playground on her own. About halfway through the parking lot Missy stopped in her tracks. She started backing up against my neighbor's legs, trying to push my neighbor back toward home, while growling like the neighbor had never heard before. She looked up into the bushes and realized she could see the silhouette of a man, just outside of the light from streetlight. She turned around and booked it back to her apartment as fast as a recently replaced hip could take her. When she got to the sidewalk in front of our building she turned around and saw the man standing about halfway between the playground and the parking lot where she was, dressed all in black, with his hood up, just staring directly at her. She made it in, locked the door and called the police, but by the time they got there the man was gone. I like to think he was just breaking into cars or something, but I was so scared for her and made her promise to call us if Missy needed to go out at night, no matter what time it was. We got Missy a bunch of fancy treats from the dog bakery and a ton of her favorite soft toys as a reward for being a hero. Technically morning since I get up around 3:30 to 4 a.m. for a run. One time I was running past a neighbor's trash can, and unexpected, a raccoon pops out like the world's most messed up Jack-in-the-Box and goes scurrying off into the nearby sewer. I also once was on a jog, same subdivision, when I saw a van slowly rolling down the street, lights off, with masked guys running back and forth from the van to parked cars checking doors and stealing it. I kept my distance and called the police. They sent an officer who was then able to catch them in the next subdivision. They were armed and driving a stolen vehicle. It was about 4 a.m. on a lonely street next to a public park with a hedge running its length. A deep, protracted scream from my left suddenly distracted me from the audiobook I was listening to too, and I removed my headphones. The scream swelled and was soon accompanied by fast approaching footsteps which quickly overtook me on the other side of the hedge. I stopped just as a bare-chested man erupted out of the foliage about 5 feet in front of me. His face and neck were covered in what appeared to be white powder from his nose down. For a brief moment we locked eyes, me frozen still, him wide-eyed and still screaming, then he rushed past me, off down the road, into the darkness. I was so stunned I just stood there for a few minutes, listening to his receding footsteps and screams as they faded to nothing, before replacing my headphones and continuing on my way. I still find myself wondering about that guy. Where was he going? Where had he been? How much of that powder had he ingested? I was smoking some weed, so I had a good high going at that point. My sister's little dog comes up to me, sits down and begins to stare at me to go outside. I knew no one else was going to take him out and would still get mad at him if he had an accident. It's between 1 and 2 a.m. when I step outside. I take a few steps and the neighbor asks if he can pet the dog. I said yes, but because I was high I tried to keep walking. He asked me to stop, so I do, and he's petting the dog. I begin to hear these pops, whistles, and buzzes. I swear I could have felt the air pressure around the bullets as they buzzed by. I thought I was hearing bottle rockets, so I thought the 4th is over. Why are they still playing with this? Then my neighbor tells me we're being shot at, and I ask, are you sure? Then he tells me I've been to Iraq. I know when I'm being shot at. From what I can tell, some gangbangers were shooting down the block from where we were, and some of the bullets just happened to go by us. After he told me he knew what bullets sound like, he grabbed me and got us behind a car. He then called 911 and started panicking and saying to 911 about the shooting and to get there. So, we were just hiding behind a car waiting for the police to show up. I was just wondering if we were the targets, and were they going to come up to us as we're hiding behind the car and just execute us. Thought about running back into my sister's apartment, but I also thought I'm not going to bring that back to my sister's place. So, the police eventually show up and the guy that calls goes up to them. I'm looking around for about a minute and I'm going to finish my walk with the dog. As I'm walking I see the neighbor in the back of the police car pointing at me and telling the police officers that's the guy. I saved his life, he'd be dead if it wasn't for me. The police officers ignored me, and I just continued my walk. The neighbor wasn't being arrested. It's like the others say, he was just telling the cops what just happened. He's the one that called it in, so they aren't going to take him in for it. It was on 29th South Farrell St. Chicago, Illinois. I was walking home from my cousin's house, who lived on the other side of the neighborhood from me, right as dusk started. I was about 7 or 8 at the time, so I was thrilled to be by myself even if it was for a half hour, but then I got a weird feeling that someone or something was watching me. I shrugged it off for a moment before I got completely terrified and started walking faster. Walking turned into a jog, and before soon I was running down the sidewalk, looking behind me to see if anything was chasing me. The third time I turned around, I saw a small shape about 80 feet away sprinting towards me. Of course, I freaked out and ran as fast as I have ever run. Turning back around, I realized it was a Doberman with a collar following me. I think about that time still, and as an elementary kid, not knowing what was chasing me is easily the most scared I have ever been in my life. I used to jog after work. Due to my schedule, on occasion it meant I was jogging at night. I ran in my neighborhood and came across a corner yard with a hedge all the way around it. I had an earbud in and was just kind of vibing. I noticed a woman walking her large dog towards me on the sidewalk, so I turned down a driveway to head out to the side of the street. Just as I hit the driveway, a rabbit got spooked and shot out of the hedges within a foot of me. In order to assert dominance over the rabbit, I scampered and let out an extremely high-pitched, yet manly scream. I could tell the woman walking the dog was incredibly impressed with my prowess by the way she was laughing. As I jogged past her I said, "You see that? Thing was coming right for me," and kept on my way. Most of the time though, it's dogs in fenced yards catching me off guard or drunk people. Had a story where my friend took me to these old, abandoned sawmills at night where they apparently used to sacrifice people and do some cult worship. Walked a very dark path and at some point stepped on something a little mushy. It was too dark to tell. Luckily, I had my friend behind me. He switched his flash on and there was a full-grown copperhead right by my foot. That's what I had stepped on. The snake just slithered away like nothing happened. I get up early and walk the dog while it's still dark. A block from my house I saw a ghoulish figure at roof level, with glowing eyes. Creeped the hell out of me. My neighbor decided to get an early start on Halloween decorations and had some kind of flying zombie in his gable. I was walking back to his place after a concert. It was pretty late, and we decided to take a shortcut through a construction site because we were tired from the show. Since all the streets around the construction site were closed, it was completely empty, as if the whole area were abandoned like in a zombie apocalypse, with just the two of us in the South Loop area of Chicago. We're crossing this small bridge and just chatting away about the concert. I was looking at him and then turned my head forward and was face to face with what looked like a zombie rat. Someone had taken a mummified rat or squirrel or something and used wire to position it like it was pouncing midair at your face. Scared. The combination of the abandoned construction site and the mummy rat creeped both of us out, like we fell into some serial killer's lair. So, we were like, "Oh, this thing," and ran until we hit a busy street with some traffic. Probably gonna get buried, but once coming late from work, 2 to 3 a.m., I stumbled upon a man with a ski mask, casually jogging with his huge dong jumping around. It was winter, not that running normally in the summer, but you know. And I mean Canadian, 15 centimeters snow, -20°C winter. I remember wondering what was going on when I realized there was a masked man running in my direction, but he just awkwardly looked my way and then down, like ashamed. Found out later he was a serial dick runner and there was a couple of news articles on him. He was seen on the same street. Me and 4 friends were walking in our local nature park at around 3 a.m. Now, it was the last day of summer before school started up again, so we were eager to have one last fun experience before returning. An important part of this story is that we had a friend who had recently recovered from a broken femur, so naturally we were walking a bit slower than usual. We were just about to head into this thick forest area with a small path and we all started to get a little on edge. As we entered the forest we heard this scream like no other I've ever heard before. It gave me goosebumps, even thinking back on it. No, it is giving me the creeps. I can guarantee you this was not an animal. When we heard this we all started to run at full speed in the opposite direction. Our only thoughts were to get out. As we were running I heard something running beside us and it was a fox. Now this thing that screamed could not have been this fox. But the terrifying part about this fox was that he was running right beside us, so whatever that noise came from scared him more than 5 rowdy teenagers running at full speed. When we reached the car we all had a moment of confusion. WTF was that? But then I realized one of us was missing. We immediately sprinted back to get our friend. The one with the weak femur was still back there. As we reached the spot, we saw no sign of our friend. Then, we hear this little crackling noise, and we see our friend creeping up from the trees. Turns out he hid from the thing since he knew he couldn't run away. Well, we grabbed him and took him back to the car since he was still pretty shaken. I wish I could tell you we saw what it was, or we went back, but to be honest we are all too scared to go back lol, but whatever made that scream and whatever sent that fox running, it wasn't anything like I've ever experienced. I live out in the country so when I go for walks I just go out in the woods. One night at probably like 2 a.m. I went for a walk because I couldn't sleep. Got about a mile into the woods and found something like a worshipping shrine. There was blood on the wood table, probably rabbit or some small animal because there were some small skulls. It's a little weird to find something that far out in the woods, because neighbors here are miles away. Not gonna lie, kinda freaked me out, plus not carrying that night, wasn't planning on walking that far. I just turned around and walked back. Woke up later that day and went back, nothing was there except for like an intention in the grass. When I saw that everything was gone, it really made me think that I wasn't alone that night. I was like 6 or 7, my dad and I were heading home around midnight. We lived in a 6-story building with no elevator. A topless man with a 10 inches cleaver walked down the stairs while we went up. He looked at my dad and we just stood there and let him pass. I was shaking. Now thinking about it, he had no apparent blood stain on him, he must have been late to work at the butcher. Was walking around a lake in Denver around 10 p.m. Andy saw an older Hasidic Jewish woman sitting on the bench and wondered why she was out so late. When I got closer I realized that she had ugly tattoos on her arm, and when I looked at her eyes, the only part not covered by a scarf, I realized it was a man and got chills down my spine. A couple steps later I heard them mumble and turned around, and they were sneaking behind me with a knife out. I turned around and squared up and they ran away, but my adrenaline was pumping through my veins like crazy. Then when I was almost back to my house after a short sprint, a guy walked past me and said, "This guy will blow you," under his breath to me. Decided to just stay in the rest of the night. I once was 7,000 miles away from home in a hotel in the middle of nowhere, Poland, to be precise, and decided to buy some snacks before going to bed. Started walking down the road and every store I've seen earlier that day was closed. Kept walking until I realized I was absolutely alone at 2 a.m. in a place I didn't know. Not a single noise on a dark road next to a forest. I freaked out and turned back to the hotel, but I was far away. Started running completely scared and finally arrived at the hotel sweating and agitated. Didn't know how to explain that nothing happened to me, but I was terrified. One time it was like 4 in the morning at the first place I lived away from my home city, and I couldn't sleep, so I walked down some streets and pathways I had never been through before until I came to a path that had 12-foot hedges on either side that eventually led to a swamp. It was dark and I left my phone at home, so there was no flashlight. No city lights at this point. I went for it, kept walking, and I could hear ducks. I was coming up to the swamp. It had a trail that ran around it. There were benches where you could sit and stare at the bog, all the trees in the swamp were dead, and it reeked of bird feces. I kept walking when I found someone sitting straight up on one of the benches in a white sheet, covering everything so you couldn't see their face or body. Legs weren't on the ground, and they were dead still, just sitting there in the white sheet. Normally that wouldn't be that intimidating, but at 4 a.m. in the pitch black and completely alone, it felt like the start of a horror movie. At first I couldn't tell what it was, so I go closer until I realized it was someone under a sheet. I turned around immediately and went straight home to bed. Scared the hell out of me. It was around the new year, in 2000, and I was 18. Had 6 friends over to hang out with since parents were going to be out really late. I lived in the middle of the woods out in the country, in the Midwest. There is a big machine shed about 200 yards away from the house lit up by a stadium light. There is another in front of the house, so the surrounding yards were dimly lit. We had left a bunch of liquor up at the bar in the shed, and 3 of us started walking up there while the others were in the house. When we were about 50 feet away, we saw this person-like figure bolt out of the shed. The main door is always open, and run into the trees. And I mean fast. It was maybe 10 feet from that night, yet somehow none of us could see anything but its shape. We naturally thought some people were robbing my shed and we were a bit spooked, but being young redneck boys with an overdeveloped sense of cowboyism, I told one friend to run back to get the others and my gun. Me and the other friend waited under the light. My friend and I saw the figure right away. That whole timber to the west there has exceptionally low weed cover and the trees are spread evenly apart, which made it easy to watch it. As we strained to keep an eye on it through the dimly lit trees, it started moving around slowly. We watched as it stepped behind a tree and just vanished. The tree wasn't thick, maybe 9 inches in diameter, but the figure stepped behind it on one side and simply didn't appear on the opposite side. Now my friend and I'd adrenaline spiked as we whisper hurriedly things like, "Did you see that?" As we were quizzing each other and planning around to find it, the rest of the group came running up. One friend had the smarts to hop in his car and drive up so his headlights could light up the whole scene. My friend handed me my .22 rifles, and apparently decided to bring all the rest of my guns, 2 pistols and a shotgun, so now a fairly armed group. We were hicks, but we were nerdy hicks, so I'm sure we looked quite the sight. We all see the thing as it casually yet purposefully steps out from behind a different tree than before. Now everyone is on edge as every signal in my brain screamed, "Alarm, something's not right, alarm." We all sensed it and saw what we each saw, but no one spoke at that time. We were too fixated and shocked at what we were seeing. Later in the night, as we all sat around sharing our perception of what happened, we all said the same things we couldn't comprehend at the time. When it stepped out, it didn't cast a shadow. The headlights and fixed lamp were casting plenty of light into the trees now, and the trees' shadows and our shadows were there, but not this thing. Its head was narrower and longer than normal. Its arms too. And it was tall, hence the 8-foot-tall guy moniker. It moved briskly to another tree and disappeared like before. A few moments later, it walked out from behind a different tree 10 feet away in the opposite direction. It was like it teleported. It then repeated this game several more times. All this allowed us to get plenty of eyes on it, but not me or anyone else could describe it. It's like the lights lit up everything around it, but not the thing itself. Except the eyes, we all agreed it had silver eyes, but the crazy part. We all only saw the eyes like out of our peripheral, they just weren't there if you looked at it dead on. After several minutes of this, I finally raised my rifle and tried to sound tough. "This is private property, and we are armed. Come towards us slowly and show yourself or I will shoot." That thing stopped dead in its tracks, turned to face me and studied us for a moment, and then with purpose it extended a leg and stepped behind a tree that couldn't have been 4 inches wide and vanished. Several minutes go by and nothing. We eventually decided to huddle up and go back to the house. The friend in the car drives down ahead. We made it maybe 20 feet when a friend's GF started screaming. The thing was following us about 50 foot south of us, hugging the tree line. It moved wrong, like it was moving its body from a pouncing, slightly crouched over posture to a sprint posture, all while jogging slowly. It literally made your brain hit the brakes hard as it tried to make sense of the visual input. There's a great book by Stephen King called From a Buick 8 where these cops come across this humanoid creature from another dimension that's so incredibly different from us that their brains can't handle it, and they are overcome with fear so terribly that they beat the creature to death in a fit of insanity and fear and rage. Every time I think back to that deep, instinctual fear that we felt that night, and every time I say the way it moved or looked or behaved was simply wrong, I think of that scene in that book. Collectively, everyone that had a gun opened fire without a word. It was if we all had the same instinctual response. Now I can't speak for my friends, but I am and have always been a crack shot with a rifle. I was just raised hunting since I could walk, so I was shocked when I watched leaves blown apart and branches snap and dirt kick up as the collective firing of birdshot, 22, 38, and 44 ammo blow everything apart around that thing, but that thing itself never seemed to be hit. I'm going to sum up the rest as it went by in a blur. We all ran for the house when the ammo dried up. Some were already inside, including the dogs who were terrified of the thing. Or maybe they were scared of us, who knows? We huddled in the living room and waited. Soon we heard footsteps clattering across the porch, and I mean clattering as in the thing had nails of some sort, but let me tell you those sounds were strange and unique too. Next we heard it seemingly climbing up the side of the house behind us, click 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 across the roof, and then a thud as it jumped 3 stories down to the ground. Then rinse and repeat on every side of the house, sometimes repeatedly and sometimes with minutes of pauses between. Eventually we escorted each other to the bathroom, and I and a friend saw it through the sliding glass deck doors as it launched itself over the deck railing, a 15-foot drop there, as we walked back from the bathroom. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the thing seemed to stop. Not long after my parents' car turned into our driveway. We all agreed to hightail it to my room because no way we're trying to explain all of the guns out and what happened all night. As soon as we got to my room, someone asked, shouldn't we warn them? We all had the feeling they would be okay, so we didn't, but looking back telling this as an adult, now good God yes we should have warned them. I had a large 2-room basement bedroom. It sounds fancier than it was, trust me, so we just got comfortable and turned my TV on. My parents came inside and eventually my mom poked her head in to say goodnight, none the wiser to all that we'd been through. We all tried to sleep soon after that and we all slept like hell, but it didn't bother us anymore that night. Throughout the rest of that year, there were several more credible sightings from everyone in the group. Even a couple more people got pulled into the story as they were with us when we'd see it again. I think about 11 people overall got to clearly see it that year. Nothing to write about because, well, how do I explain this? Have you ever noticed that when people want to ignore something, even something dangerous, they pretend it isn't happening? Like, okay, yes, we see this thing, but there's nothing we can do about it or get closure on anything about it. So what can you do? You just go about your life, and if you happen to see it running towards you and your friend as you walk to the car at night, you both just hurry up, get in, lock the doors, and speed off. And go in with your night. Rinse and repeat throughout the year. Yes, over the years I've tried to find info. The closest thing I've found is Native American and First Nations lore about shadow spirits and shadow people, but they didn't seem to fit exactly right. And yes, I'm a very skeptical person. I am very married to science and common sense. But that thing, well, my brain just goes, I got nothing, you're on your own, buddy. Maybe it was interdimensional, or an alien, or a demon, or some spirit. Except none of those answers feel right and most sound crazy to me, so I don't know. Even 20 years later, I still struggle with impulsively trying to downplay any of it because I can't explain it rationally. Yes, I still go into wooded areas at night in other places, I never fear anything happening. I love camping. However, I inherited that same homestead a few years back and I notice I am uneasy as hell being outside at night here. I run a small farm there though, so I have to be out after dark. I haven't seen anything yet and I hope I haven't. Normally you know when it's around, your anxiety goes from 0 to the red line the moment you step into the dark and that's how you know it's coming. That hasn't happened yet, but the past few weeks something has been feeling a bit off. I don't carry a gun with me usually. I've convinced myself over the years that it's ultimately benign, so if I see it, I'm going to do my best to either ignore it, or converse with it. God help me. I believe in ghosts, I don't think they are part of the material reality, they aren't real. However, they exist inside of your mind, as broken thoughts, or something like that, they are ideas. That said, I live a good part of the year on the countryside of Spain, and I like to go to walk in the nights alone in the nature. There's a little house like about 2 kilometers from my home village that was owned by a man who killed himself with a shotgun in an accident. I like to get drunk alone and walk. In the past I used to smoke too. One especially dark night almost without moon I saw a clear man's shadow on the path. I know it was my imagination, however that scared me so much that I refused to continue walking on that path. Elders have related stories. I know that the knowledge of the story of that house can suggest that kind of events. As I said, ghosts are ideas. Nevertheless, I won't use that path at night, ever.
Many years ago, my boyfriend and I decided to take a late-night walk around his generally safe neighborhood. We got a few steps past the driveway when a shirtless guy came running over with a hammer in one hand and a machete in the other. My boyfriend stayed super calm and asked the man what was going on. Apparently, some man had just broken into his apartment and tried to kidnap his young daughter, so he was chasing him down to either shatter his fingers with the hammer or chop off his hands entirely with the machete, and he thought my boyfriend was possibly this man. My boyfriend gave me his car keys and told me to take myself home. We lived apart at the time, so I went and got his car, and by the time I was backing out of the driveway, the man was screaming at my boyfriend, who was just standing there calmly with his hands in the air. I drove a block away so the man wouldn't see me, rolled the windows down to try to hear what was happening, and called the police officers. The machete man ended up running off and I don't know if they ever got him. My boyfriend was fine though, thank God. My boyfriend and I had been exploring some dirt roads on Vancouver Island, south of Nanaimo. We found this super rundown campsite beside a river and decided to take a look. It had been snowing the whole drive and the entire site was covered in pristine snow. At one point we split up so I could find a place to pee. He went south and I went northwest. I finished and wandered back south when I noticed completely fresh boot treads in the snow heading north and out of the sight. They went right by where I'd stopped to pee in the bushes. My hair was standing on end when I alerted my BF to the tracks. They'd actually skirted the edge of the site from the road, past where I was peeing, and north out into the woods. Needless to say, we get out of there fast. The trip back turned into a fiasco too. What a gong show. Adding fiasco. We had driven past a large metal gate on our way to the site. When we got back to it, we found it locked with 2 trucks already there. One was on our side, and the other was on the opposite side. They were wrapping it in chains in order to bust the lock open. We stepped out of the car and panicked a bit. It was dark, snow everywhere, and a couple of hours from home. The 2 trucks are about to step on the gas when some car pulls up and a lady jumps out, yelling. They were the ones that closed the gate on us. I suspect that they did it on purpose since the signage said 6 p.m. and it was 5 p.m. The lady opens the gate, and we all leave. The 2 trucks start driving away like maniacs. They were long gone by the time we got past the dirt road and onto asphalt. That didn't last long though. We saw a lot of swerving tire tracks, and it became clear that they were showboating. Then we came across the wreck. One of the trucks was overturned on the opposite side of the road. The other truck and a few more drivers were there helping the occupants. They weren't injured, but their truck was definitely stuck in the ditch. Honestly, I'm surprised they were all fine. I, 33F, don't personally feel particularly unsafe walking alone at night, which is helpful, because the first 2 years I lived in Los Angeles, I worked late and didn't have a car, so I had to rely on public transportation. The first month I lived in Hollywood, I was getting off the last Red Line train at Hollywood/Highland at like 2 a.m. and saw a guy who'd just been stabbed bleeding out on the sidewalk in front of Forever 21 near the corner. The blood was running down the stairs on the sidewalk toward the street, and a police officer was just standing there all nonchalant as this man cried into the lap of someone trying to comfort him. I wish I knew what happened to him, but when I tried looking it up, there were no reports of anything, and they'd just hosed off the sidewalk in the night for the morning tourists. It's like it never happened. Another time, while walking home down Highland toward Santa Monica Boulevard, I saw a guy pull a gun on one of the hookers that hung around the area, and he ran away when he saw me watching. That hooker always said hi to me after that whenever I'd see her on my night walks home. Hollywood at night is a different city. When I was 22 and newly pregnant, I was visiting my mom and dad in an extremely small county town. My parents have a Mastiff and Rhodesian Ridgeback mix named Riley, who is normally the sweetest, silly dog in the world. His eyes just have so much personality and love, it's hard to not want to squish him to death. But he's a big boy, just over 100 pounds, and pure muscle. My mom was at work and my dad was out running errands, so I was home by myself with the pup. A white windowless van pulls up in front of the house and a guy got out in sort of dirty clothes, obviously not a salesperson or working for a company. He came up to the door and knocked. When I answered the door he seemed a bit startled, like he wasn't expecting anyone to be home. There was a locked, metal screen door separating us, and before he could even explain why he was there, Riley started this deep growl, and all the hair from his neck to his tail stood up. The guy jumped back like 2 feet and sort of mumbled if we wanted to buy any meat from his van, and when I said no he promptly spun around on his heels and ran back to his van and left the neighborhood. The entire time the guy was at our door he was snarling and growling, just being super aggressive. When the guy left and I sat back down on the couch, Riley basically laid on top of me and couldn't stop giving me kisses. Walking my dog, and up ahead, I see a deer. I stop and try to get my dog to see it. He's oblivious to it, so I keep inching closer. As my attention was focused on the deer in front of me, I missed noticing the 2 deer that came crashing into the road about 3 feet from me. Both were taller than I am, and they ran past me. It's been like 8 years, and I still hear the clapping of their hooves on the road. I screamed like a little girl. I almost got kidnapped. I usually go on walks late at night, and one night I was trying to cross an intersection, looking both ways, seeing no cars coming in my direction, so I continued on my way home until I saw a blacked out minivan following behind me. I just assume it's a police officer or something, until they drive closer and closer to my sidewalk, almost running me over in the process. The man then proceeded to roll the window down and tried to ask me for directions as he was lost. However, I had a weird feeling about the whole interaction. His body language said it all. I immediately started running away, luckily into a trail nearby where he most likely couldn't see me or drive into. That was the quickest run of my life back home. To make matters worse, after I ran, I also saw him speed up, park his van, and look for me on the trail. 2 words: rabid squirrels. There was an outbreak of rabies in a squirrel population in my neighborhood during my senior year of high school. My BF at the time lived about a 20-minute walk away, and neither of us drove, so we frequently had to walk through rabid squirrel territory. In the middle of the night, hearing them make noises like something out of a zombie movie while skittering above you when it's too dark to see them is horrifying. 0 out of 10 would not recommend. It was more what I didn't see. We were in Montana, just north of Yellowstone, staying in a cabin in the middle of nowhere on a former ranch. We misjudged our hike and ended up coming back right at dusk/dark. We were a little nervous, but to reassure each other, I reminded myself and my husband that as long as we saw the usual 5,000 deer on the way to our cabin, we were probably okay. Every night there were tons of deer everywhere on the ranch who really weren't scared of us at all since the owners didn't allow hunting, but that night there was not a single deer. We didn't hear or see any animals at all, when every other night we'd seen at least 4 or 5 deer, possums, and an extremely cute skunk just from our porch. It was nerve-wracking as hell, but we kept our bear spray ready, talked loudly, and walked at a steady pace. The owners called us the next day to warn us to be careful after dark because a cougar had been sighted at a neighboring farm. We made sure to get back before dark for the rest of the trip.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.